A sepia circus card from around 1880 freezes everything in place. Two men in top hats stand beside a third figure whose scale looks impossible. He is not standing on a platform. There is no box, no obvious trick, and no easy answer in the frame. The caption underneath asks whether he is a miracle of nature or the finest deception in show business. But that choice may be the trick. That question is where the trap begins. Once a body is placed inside a circus frame, people stop asking what else it might be. The archive kept repeating the same pattern. Different names, different cities, but always the same two options: freak of nature or stage illusion. Colonel Ruth Goshen, Martin Van Buren Bates, Angus MacAskill, Chang Yu Sing, Edouard Beaupré, Ella Ewing. The list stretches across continents. Their official heights cluster in a narrow band, usually around 2.5 meters. The records make their own strange kind of border. Medical language gave the whole subject a tidy explanation: gigantism, acromegaly, a broken pituitary gland. The file looked closed before anyone asked harder questions. But then the newspaper layer appears. Reports from America, Ireland, Turkey, and Peru describe skeletons far beyond ordinary human scale. 3 meters, 3.5, more than that, if the headlines are to be believed. Every article pushes the boundary a little farther. And that is where the contradiction starts. The same newspapers are trusted for elections, courts, and presidents, yet mocked when the subject turns to giants. Across the world, the same formula repeats. Same body, same suspicion, same forced choice, miracle or fraud. The language itself becomes a cage. If these bodies were only medical curiosities, why did the story spread so efficiently through rival empires, separate languages, and distant newspapers? Because by the late 1800s, transportation, telegraph lines, and newspapers could standardize a narrative faster than most governments could correct it. This is where the circus matters most. It was the perfect place to display something real, while making sure nobody took it seriously enough. The label did the work: monster, fraud, medical case. Anything except the one possibility that would have changed the story completely. That possibility is what Tartaria theorists keep pointing to: a world with different scales, different ruins, and bodies too large for the modern frame. They point to oversized doors, vast halls, and towering ceilings in old buildings. Were these only stylistic choices, or traces of another scale entirely? The question never stays quiet for long. If those spaces were built only for grandeur, why do the same proportions appear again and again? Between 1820 and 1910, old architectural worlds were being demolished, remodeled, or absorbed into new institutions. Giant figures appear in the same stretch of time. They were pushed into entertainment almost immediately. Monster, imposter, medical specimen, never anything else. The box was built before the witness could speak. The darkest part comes after death. Edouard Beaupré died in 1904, yet his body was retained, displayed, and treated like an object. His family wanted a proper burial. The request was ignored for decades, and the silence around that refusal feels deliberate. A body kept for 100 years does not happen by accident. It suggests a question some institution did not want answered, and that is only the first layer. Beneath the circus posters, the archive keeps hinting at a past we were never meant to take seriously. The next layer opens in the margins of old circus posters, where the giants were never introduced as ordinary men. They were framed as curiosities first, and people second. That label mattered. Once a body entered the circus catalogue, it stopped being read as evidence, and started being read as entertainment, even when the proportions looked impossible. And once that happened, the public learned a shortcut: call it a freak show, and whatever stood on the platform no longer needed to be examined too closely. But the archive does not only preserve labels. It preserves repeated shapes, repeated faces, and repeated measurements that appear in separate cities with disturbing consistency. That consistency is what makes the giants hard to dismiss. If the same description appears in Paris, St. Maïs, Petersburg, and New York, the story stops looking local. It starts looking coordinated. Different publishers, different languages, same trap, either a medical defect or a performance trick, nothing in between. And that formula mattered because it trained the audience before they ever arrived. A giant could be seen, but never truly believed. So the question becomes sharper. If disbelief is engineered first, what kind of person can be hidden in plain sight by making them look ridiculous? That is where the giant cases become difficult. Some were exhibited with exact height claims, yet the records around their births are thin, uneven, or strangely incomplete. In a century obsessed with paperwork, their absence is not trivial. It is exactly the kind of gap that makes later certainty impossible. As the image is compared against later records, the same body is measured, displayed, and moved between institutions as if ownership mattered more than identity. What makes this case disturbing is not the publicity itself, but what followed after death. The body stayed in circulation long after the performance ended. That is not how a simple medical case is remembered. That is how a specimen is managed, measured, and kept from the people who loved it. And then there are the photographs. Some of the clearest giant images come from a brief era before studio tricks became standardized, and before public relations learned to control every angle. No platform, no obvious prop, no neat illusion waiting to be exposed. Just a body that seems to dominate the frame in a way normal staging cannot easily explain. That is why the image matters. Once a giant is presented a spectacle, every later viewer inherits the same instruction: question the frame, not the body. Yet the archive also hints at something else. Giant figures appearing near old buildings with oversized doors, tall ceilings, and public interiors made for a scale that feels unsettled. Those buildings matter because they keep resurfacing in the same debates. Were they simply grand, or were they scaled for bodies we later stopped acknowledging? The uncomfortable part is not that the buildings are strange. It is that the giants and the buildings seem to belong to the same visual problem, over and over again. Some researchers place this shift in the 19th century when old structures were demolished, repurposed, or absorbed into new institutional stories at remarkable speed. At the same time, giant performers move from public wonder into administrative control. They are classified, labeled, and managed, which is another way of saying they become easier to contain. That transition is the key. Once the body leaves the tent and enters the institution, the language changes from wonder to diagnosis, and the story narrows. In that narrowing, the giant becomes legible only as a case. The person disappears behind the explanation, and the explanation is treated as the final word. But the archive keeps refusing to stay that simple. The same posters, the same measurements, and the same architectural scale continue to point toward a larger forgotten context. And if that context was deliberately buried, then the giants were never just strange people on posters. They were clues, left in plain sight, waiting for someone to read them differently. By the 1880s, the giant poster had become a weapon. It promised wonder, but it also trained the public to doubt whatever stood before them. That doubt was useful. Once a giant was labeled a freak, the crowd stopped asking where he came from, who knew him, or what was hidden behind the poster. That is exactly why the same giant names kept reappearing. The posters changed cities, but the script stayed identical: marvel, mockery, and silence. And in that silence, another story grew. If these people were not simply rare bodies, then the posters were not entertainment at all. They became evidence without ever being treated like evidence. Their bodies were displayed, but their origins were quietly pushed outside the frame. That is where the first real fracture appears. When the same names follow the same route, the question is no longer whether they existed. It is whether they were being arranged. That pattern appears again and again in circus billing, in newspaper notices, and in surviving photograph captions. The official measurements were narrow, almost suspiciously narrow. Most of the famous giants cluster around the same heights, as if the category itself was being standardized. A body that large should have left a wider paper trail. Instead, the paper trail often thins right where the family history should begin. That absence matters. In a bureaucratic century, missing records are not always accidents. Sometimes they are the strongest sign that someone was managed. Then came the newspaper accounts of giant bones. They appeared in places as far apart as Ireland, Peru, Turkey, and the American frontier. The reports were easy to dismiss until you noticed the same shape of story repeating across continents. Different editors, different cities, same impossible scale. And here the story turns. The same century that measured giants also built enormous halls, doors, and corridors that seemed strangely scaled to another order of body. Some researchers look at those buildings and see adaptation, not ornament. Wide staircases, high ceilings, and immense entryways may not have been accidental at all. If the official history is right, why does the scale keep repeating? The same oversized language appears in train stations, exhibition halls, and public institutions. That is where Tartaria enters the picture. On old maps, the name stretches across enormous regions and then slowly disappears from common use. For some, that disappearance is administrative. For others, it looks like something older was overwritten by newer categories, new borders, and new definitions. The giants fit that same pattern of replacement. Once the world could call them freaks or patients, it no longer had to ask what came before the labels, and that reclassification had consequences. A person on a stage can be laughed at, a person in a specimen room can be controlled forever. That is why the later institutional silence feels so deliberate. The story was not only moved, it was made difficult to recover on purpose. Some of the strongest clues come from old photographs taken before studio conventions became rigid. In those images, scale is harder to hide. Not every image proves anything by itself. But when enough images keep returning to the same proportions, the question stops being decorative and becomes urgent. Because the real issue is not simply whether a giant was born or staged or mislabeled. The real issue is who controlled the meaning assigned to the body. When a century teaches people to laugh first, it also teaches them not to ask about provenance, burial, or ownership. What gets erased when a life is turned into a curiosity? And if those giants were clues, not curiosities, then the next archive may hold more than another odd photograph. It may hold the missing context behind the entire disguise. In a locked university storage room, a sealed crate marked only with a number is finally opened. Inside are stripped exhibition boards, not bones, and that detail changes everything. The boards come from a travelling show that once toured railway towns across 2 continents. Their captions never mention the men's names first. They advertise size, rarity, and disbelief. That was not an accident. It was a branding machine, and it trained audiences to look at an enormous body as either spectacle or fraud. In the shipping ledgers, the same names reappear beside different cities. The format changes, the language changes, but the promise never does. Then the tax records appear. A man billed as a giant is suddenly ordinary on paper, a wage earner, a renter, a worker with repeated addresses. That paper trail matters because it narrows the mystery. These figures were not floating legends. They moved through contracts, leases, and newspapers. Yet the more stable the paperwork becomes, the stranger the silence around their childhoods. Parents, birthplaces, siblings, the small facts that should anchor them, often disappear. That silence is not proof of nothing. It is proof of selection, of someone deciding which details would survive and which would be buried. And once you look at the promotional photos again, the staging becomes obvious. A curtain, a painted backdrop, and then the giant is placed where the frame can control him. The trick was never subtle. It was repetition. If you keep seeing the same pose, the same costume, and the same caption, you stop asking where the body came from. In one provincial newspaper, a giant's tour is announced beside weather reports and livestock prices. That placement made the event feel civic, not strange. That is exactly why the disguise worked. It did not hide the giant in darkness. It hid him inside everyday life, where attention was already exhausted. Then came the measurements. Height was often reported to the inch, but width, weight, and proportions were described vaguely, as if precision would invite trouble. That vagueness is useful. A body can be exaggerated, but a record can be engineered to keep the exaggeration just believable enough. In museum correspondence, a different tone appears. The same bodies are no longer public attractions. They're specimen opportunities, to be acquired quietly. That institutional language is colder than any circus poster. A poster wants applause, a collection file wants custody. And once custody begins, families lose control. They can request burial, but institutions can stall, redirect, and wait until the outrage cools. One retained skeleton was measured, catalogued, and displayed as if it had never belonged to a person. The transformation from man to object was complete. That is the hidden pivot in the story. Once the body enters science, the question of identity becomes secondary to classification, and classification is a powerful disguise. It can make a person feel like a problem solved, even when the underlying story remains untouched. So the archive keeps splitting the same figure into categories: performer, patient, specimen, rumor. Each label reduces him, but none resolves the disappearance. No one had to erase the giant all at once. They only had to make every archive point somewhere else whenever you asked who he really was. That is why the surviving photographs feel so important now. They are not just showpieces. They are the last public moments before custody hardened into silence. If the disguise worked for a century, it worked because the public accepted the frame. They were invited to see a freak, not a historical contradiction. And that leaves one final problem. If the archive can mislabel a giant so completely, what else in the missing collection was hidden the same way? The archive did not begin with a corpse or a skeleton, but with a cabinet card. One giant, one label, and a question nobody seemed eager to answer. That card had the same trap hidden in dozens of others. Look, stare, dismiss. The giant becomes a freak, and the contradiction disappears inside the label. But the same faces kept returning under different names, in different towns, across different empires. That repetition is what made the story impossible to ignore. Then the records started thinning out. Birth papers, church books, census entries, the ordinary paper trail that should have been thick around such famous bodies. And that is where the official explanation began to wobble. If these people were only medical anomalies, why did so many traces vanish so neatly? The measurements themselves were suspiciously tidy, around 7 feet 8, 7 feet 11, 8 feet 2, as if the giant had been sorted into a manageable category. Medicine offered the neatest answer possible: gigantism, acromegaly, a gland gone wrong. A diagnosis can close a file faster than any argument. But outside the circuses, old newspapers kept surfacing with something else entirely. Reported skeletons far larger than the performers on the poster. Those reports were easy to mock, and that is exactly why they survived. A scandalous headline can carry a forbidden question farther than a sober report ever could. Across continents, the script stayed the same. Different languages, different capitals, same verdict, miracle or fraud, but never history. That uniformity matters. Empire to empire, city to city, the crowd was trained to expect the same two options whenever a giant appeared. So ask yourself this: if the body was only a medical oddity, why did the public story need such a narrow cage? Where did the third option go? Because once you remove the word freak, the whole arrangement looks different. A giant is no longer entertainment, he becomes evidence. That shift is exactly what institutions feared. Evidence can be measured, compared, and archived in ways a stage act never is. Take Edouard Beaupré, dead in 1904, then displayed, preserved, and denied a normal burial for years. A man became a specimen before his family could reclaim him. A body kept that long was not forgotten. It was controlled, catalogued, and protected from the one thing that would have ended the conversation: burial. And the deeper you go, the stranger the architecture becomes. Massive doors, vaulted halls, oversized corridors, spaces that seem built for a different scale. If those buildings were only decorative, why do the proportions repeat across regions? The question keeps surviving every simple explanation. Tartaria enters here, not as fantasy, but as a vanished name on old maps, once visible, later erased, and still not fully explained by the official record. Some researchers think the giants and those buildings belong to the same buried layer of history. I am not asking you to accept it, only to notice the pattern. Because the pattern is not just size, it is disappearance. Bodies moved from public view into locked institutions, while the language around them became smaller and safer. And that is the real trick of the circus label. It did not prove the giants were fake. It made them laughable before anyone could ask what they meant. So the archive leaves us with one hard image, a giant dismissed as spectacle, a body controlled as specimen, and a map with missing names in the background. But if the names were erased on purpose, who decided that the people themselves had to disappear with them? If that does not unsettle you, then try this instead. What else was made impossible to believe simply because it was shown under the wrong name? And if a whole people could be hidden behind labels, then what survived in the record was never the full story, only the residue of a disappearance. Because once a history is taught to you as a costume, the costume survives and the history disappears. And somewhere in the next archive, another body may still be waiting to be reclassified, because some vanishings do not end with evidence. They end with a question that keeps following you.